Latin America is still an emerging market where some gaps that are quite covered in more developed part of the world remain quite open here. And that, I think, offers a very, very, very compelling case for technology, because in other markets, you have traditional solutions that have solved those problems. And in Latin America, you don't have that in many cases. You can say, hey, in the US, you have a larger market. That is true. But when you look at Latin America, you say, hey, there's a bigger gap. So I think the net impact of technology in the world is going to be terrific, but it's going to be larger in emerging markets.
Welcome to another episode of Outsider Inc. I'm your host, Ian Hathaway. Today's guest is Hernan Kazah, co-founder of Mercado Libre, managing partner of Kaszek, and one of the foundational architects of Latin America's tech ecosystem. More than 2 decades ago, Hernan and his co-founders put Latin America on the global tech map, building Mercado Libre from scratch at a time when internet adoption in the region was close to zero, capital was scarce, and there was no real tech ecosystem to lean on. What started as a simple idea, an online marketplace for Latin America, became one of the most important technology companies ever built outside of Silicon Valley, surviving the Dotcom crash and eventually going public on the NASDAQ, where today, the company trades at a more than $100 billion market cap. After more than a decade building Mercado Libre into a regional giant, Hernan stepped away in 2011 to co-found Kaszek with a deliberate ambition to take everything he'd learned as a founder and operator and apply it to backing the next generation of Latin American entrepreneurs at the earliest stages of their journeys. Kaszek has backed many of the companies that now define Latin America's modern tech ecosystem, including Nubank, QuintoAndar, Creditas, Gympass, and Kavak, becoming the most influential venture capital firm in the region and helping turn what was once a fragile, fragmented startup scene into something far more sustaining. What makes Hernan's story different isn't just the scale of what he's built. It's the perspective he's earned by living through every phase of the journey: founder, operator, public company executive, and venture investor. He's seen firsthand how much of success comes down to timing, discipline, and resilience, especially in markets that don't move on Silicon Valley's schedule. Today, we'll talk about what those experiences teach you about trust, conviction, patience, and building things that last, especially in markets where the path forward is rarely obvious. Hernan, welcome to Outsider Inc.
I'm very glad to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me.
It's so good to see you. I'm glad to be kicking off the new year with you. Thanks so much for being here. You have had a remarkable journey, but when I look at that arc of your story, the thing that jumps out to me most is your ability to see opportunity in people, in places, and in ideas that aren't obvious, at least not yet. It's a recurring theme that feels rooted in your upbringing. You were raised in a middle-class suburb of Buenos Aires. Your parents were public servants who placed a strong emphasis on education and a belief that progress can come from effort rather than entitlement. So when you look back on that time in your life, how did you see the opportunities that were available to you? And how do you think that early lens shaped the way you approach work and ambition today?
That's a great question and a very comprehensive one. I had 2 great, very supportive parents. I have 2 good sisters, and we were a modest, happy family, I would say, with that focus on studying, on working hard, but also on enjoying things. And I wasn't that much focused on what we were lacking, but enjoying what we had. But I was always very, very curious and in a good way unsatisfied. So I always wanted to learn more and visit more places. So I decided to go to high school. That was not the typical high school that was available in my neighbor. And for that, I had to qualify for it and pass some exams, and ended up being a great experience because it really opened up my horizons and allowed me to meet people that came from different backgrounds and had different aspirations. And from there, I went to the university, a little bit because I was curious, as I said, but also because some of my classmates during high school wanted to go that way, and I somehow admired them. And one thing took to another, as that very famous speech of Steve Jobs says, when you look backwards, it's very evident how you connect the dots. But it's not that I had everything planned at all, because I went to a good high school. I ended up being quite successful in the local university. And because of that, I got an interesting job. And that interesting job maybe drove me to Stanford. And there I met Marcos Galperin, who was until this year the CEO of Mercado Libre for 26 years, my co-founder at the company. And in Mercado Libre, I met Nicolas, with whom we started Kaszek Ventures. So things somehow look as evident. Obviously, you went to Stanford because you wanted to start a company, and because you started a company, you wanted to be a VC, but none of that was part of a macro plan. But the plan was always out of curiosity, trying to be exposed to interesting things. More importantly, to interesting people that somehow I admired. And I think in that regard, I was quite lucky. It was not that I was a rebellious person, but I always was uncomfortable with the status quo and I wanted to change things and try new things. Then once you go into something, commit to it and really focus on making it work. And failure is not an option, right? We had to make it work. And I think that's something that I really focused on during all the different phases of my career. And then obviously luck. Luck always plays an important role. We went through many challenges, as you mentioned, but luckily those challenges did not kill us. And once you go through those challenges and you endure them, then you end up at the end of the tunnel being stronger and with more resilience and more prepared. You as a person and the company are involved with as well.
I always like to say it's better to be lucky than to be good. Hopefully you can be both, but luck certainly plays a part. You touched on so many things there. You are a product of your environment, the company you keep, right? Questioning the status quo, having a commitment. These are themes that play out through your life and are what make for great entrepreneurs. You mentioned that you went to the University of Buenos Aires, studied economics. First job was at Procter Gamble as a brand manager. Sounds like you had some real responsibility early on, but at the same time, I would have to imagine that felt a little bureaucratic working for a large corporation like that. When you look back at that experience, what did it teach you about how big companies operate? And maybe what did you learn from that you brought with you into the next phases of your journey?
That's a very relevant piece of my career. And during that time, Procter Gamble was a great organization, right? It was one of those that professional young graduates wanted to join. And I'm really thankful for that opportunity I had. But as you well said, it was too bureaucratic for a young kid that was 22 years old and wanted to change things and did not respect a lot the status quo. I was brand manager. And it was a small-sized brand that luckily nobody paid too much attention to, so I had lots of degrees of freedom to do whatever I wanted. And it was very evident we had to change price, we had to change the distribution incentives for our sales force. It was very evident that we had to change packaging and sourcing of the product. And everyone agreed that it was evident that we had to execute the plan I put together. But in a big organization, you had to know for whatever you want to do with sales, you had to collect several signatures to get the approval of the manager of sales and the manager of whatever and the manager of the country and the manager of the district. So everything required lots of bureaucratic steps that I felt were ridiculous. And I became quite frustrated with it. I started to think, okay, this is not the place for me. I appreciate what I learned and I met very interesting people. It's not the place for me. And I ended up leaving and went to Stanford for my MBA. My recollection was, okay, Procter Gamble was a good experience, but ridiculous bureaucracy. It's like the Politburo of the Soviet Union in their worst years. and then we started Mercado Libre. But once you change your role and you are the one that somehow is setting the rules and wants to establish some processes and ensure that the results obviously depend on people, but also on ensuring that everything is aligned with the strategy you have and with the vision you have. And we started to put in place a light version, all those processes that Procter & Gamble had. And it was then when it clicked and said, okay, now we understand why Procter & Gamble has been successful for over 150 years, right? It's like those processes, many things that then you start realizing, well, there was a reason why they were in place. And the net result, even though for that particular decision, you may feel that it's a pain in the neck, it made sense, right? That ensures the process ends up producing the right decision, regardless of who's the person that at that moment is making that decision. And I think I valued that significantly. And I'm very happy that I had that experience. It was a terrific learning experience. And obviously, nowadays, I speak with many young professionals that are starting their careers and want some advice. And most of them come to me saying, I want to be an entrepreneur. And I tell them, amazing. If you want to be an entrepreneur and you know exactly what problem you want to solve, and you feel that you have the right to find the solution for that problem and win in that market, go and do it. Otherwise, why don't you explore one of these large corporations that have great processes, that are going to be a terrific learning experience for you? And once you're there, maybe you end up finding that that's the place for you. Maybe you end up finding that it's not the place for you. Totally fine. But gain that experience that is very relevant and will serve you there or anywhere else you may end up going.
I think that's a great insight. So the things that agitated you there as a young man, you grew later in your career to appreciate. And I love that, having the right to go and win that market. That's really good advice. After P&G, you made a big move. You left Argentina in 1997 to pursue your MBA at Stanford. This was really the first time you stepped outside of the Argentine public education system. And it came at a really interesting time to be in Silicon Valley. The internet and technology were really starting to feel transformative. This is a place where professors are building companies, classmates are launching startups, and you're sitting in rooms with people like Steve Jobs and Bill Gates and others who have made these massive outcomes maybe feel less abstract and more human. Coming to Stanford as an outsider from Argentina, I have to imagine that maybe that transition felt a little bit like stepping foot on another planet. What were your initial impressions of Stanford and the people that were around you?
Yeah, it's exactly what you're saying. For me, initially, it was like being in another planet. I learned English when I went to Stanford, more or less. So it's not that I was bilingual before going to Stanford. The system was totally different. You would go to each class with everything prepared. The objective of the class was to somehow discuss the topic that you had studied and use the professor as the moderator. And everything was public speaking in English. And I felt that I was 5 notches behind everyone. And on top of that, when I was at the university or when I was working at Procter Gamble, I felt that I was part of the crowd. And I understood what people were doing, where they were going. And suddenly I go to Stanford and I have a guy next to me that tells me, no, I'm going to start a search fund. I had no clue what a search fund was. No, I come from this hedge fund. Hedge fund? What the heck is that? I didn't know any of those things. And for me, I ended up closing the gap, but the learning experience was really amazing. And as you said also, I ended up meeting amazing people. I did have a class with Steve Jobs. I have a picture with him. I did have a class with Bill Gates. I did have a class with Warren Buffett. And obviously, all of those are incredible experiences. But the one thing I remember is they look like humans. And before meeting them in person, they were like people that were from another planet and were totally different from us. And obviously, they were amazing people, super accomplished, ridiculously bright, with a vision and a conviction that was incredible. But they were people, right? And that for me was, wow. It's like, okay, I may not get there, but they have more things in common with me than different things. So that thing of having those classmates that knew how the world worked and wanted to do interesting things and new things, as you said, professors that were involved not only in teaching, but also in advising companies and building companies, being at that particular point in time when the internet took off, right? It was 2-3 years after Netscape was created, and I was using that day in, day out at the university with a very decent broadband connectivity. So suddenly I was open to that world of incredible business people, incredible professors, incredible classmates with the internet that was surrounding everything and proposing a great opportunity for anything that you wanted to build. Also, it was leveling things up because up until then, actually, when I wrote my essays to go to Stanford, I said, eventually I want to be an entrepreneur. But I thought that was going to be something after a very successful traditional career, you could somehow make yourself independent from that big structure and create your own. And I didn't know exactly in what field, what industry, but I thought of that. I remember I wrote about it, but I thought this was going to happen 20 years after Stanford. Once I gained all these abilities and those skills. And suddenly the internet leveled everything. And actually not knowing maybe was an advantage because you could think things differently versus those that had somehow some inertia from their prior experiences and could not break out from them. And for me, it was totally free. So I became in love with the internet, with technology, and thought that what was happening initially and timidly in the US was going to happen eventually in Latin America. And that's how I ended up joining the tech world when, again, was not part of my plan. It's not that, I decided to go to Stanford because I want to join the tech ecosystem. I didn't even know that there was a tech ecosystem in a way.
Well, you touched on a couple things that I think are super important. The first was that these are just people. I've invested in entrepreneurs in Latin America, in Europe, in Asia. And one of the things I tell them is go to Silicon Valley. The people are talented. They're some of the smartest, most ambitious people in the world, but they're more a product of their environment. They're not different than you. And in fact, if your ambition is to build closer to home, you can create that environment. It's just going to take time. It's longer. It's more challenging, but they're just people. So I love that story. And then also, it sounds to me like Stanford changed things for you. Maybe it changed you. You came with not this ambition to be a tech entrepreneur, but you certainly became one by being there. You met some amazing people who shaped your life in very real ways. One of those was Marcos Galperin, a fellow Argentine who was talking to you about this idea he had about building an eBay-style marketplace for Latin America at a time when that was far from obvious. What made you lean in and say yes? Was it the idea? Was it Marcos? Was it the timing? Was it all of it? What was going on for you?
Yeah, a few things happened. One is the environment was boiling and it was really difficult to stay out of it. Again, when I joined Stanford, I thought maybe I'll join another large corporation. Maybe I join an investment bank or a consulting firm. And that was something that I felt like a very natural next step after my MBA. And suddenly I was there with everyone trying to start a company and fundraising. And that plan that looked very attractive to me when I decided to go to Stanford, suddenly once I was there, many more interesting things are happening. And with that in mind, I ended up joining a startup in my second year at Stanford. That was a startup that had an idea, had a founder, had investors, but didn't have a CEO. And I knew some of the investors, and I knew some of the people involved. They came to me and said, hey, do you know someone for this position? Can you recommend someone? And I said, yeah, that's me. And it was interesting. During my second year at Stanford, I was somehow a full-time CEO for that company, and I was also a student. And the team was in New York, and I would fly to New York from California back and forth and read the cases on the plane. And it was a very hectic time. But for me, it was amazing. I was learning by doing, not only by reading, not only by listening. Also, because I got involved with that, I started using the Stanford network more. So I would go to professor, hey, professor, I'm working on this project, and these are the challenges we have. And I would sit with that professor and exchange some ideas, and that professor would connect me with someone else. And when you're a student, hey, I'm a student from Stanford. Oh, yeah, come in. And I started to explore things. And on the one hand, it showed me the value of that network that you have in the Silicon Valley and in particular around Stanford. In that context, Marcos, whose story is also interesting, because Marcos went to Stanford sponsored by the state-owned oil company of Argentina. His plan was to go back to that company once he graduated from Stanford. And in those 2 years that we were there, the company got acquired by a Spanish company. Corporate finance would move to Madrid, and the office in Buenos Aires was less relevant, so he decided not to go back and paid back the sponsorship and started thinking about what to do in technology, because that was, again, if you wanted to do something, it had to be in technology in those days. And because I was in that project and Marco was thinking about the idea of Mercado Libre, we started exchanging ideas, and somehow I was doing more work for Marcos's idea than for the other project, and I ended up leaving that project and joining Marcos with the Mercado Libre idea. And with that, we graduated in in June 1999, and the official launching date for the company became August the 2nd of that year.
I have to imagine you had a lot of opportunities to stay in Silicon Valley, but you and Marcos decide to return to Argentina and build this company. So the challenge shifts from an idea to believing in something to now going home and actually building it, executing on it. There was no real tech ecosystem in Latin America at the time, no experienced talent, no venture capital, no infrastructure, no precedent to follow. You were building it. So how did the reality on the ground look like to you, especially as compared to spending those 2 years in Silicon Valley? And more importantly, those constraints, how do you think they shaped how you built the company, how you hired people, and how you made decisions in the early years?
Yeah, I think 3 items. One is we were totally convinced that what was starting to happen in the US with the internet and with the Amazons and the eBays of the time was going to happen in Latin America. And everyone would say, no, in Latin America, the internet will not work, or going directly into the specifics of Mercado Libre's business model, they would say people will never, ever trade with strangers and those kind of things. In Latin America, you need a higher level of trust. We knew that what we were building was very compelling and it was going to work. We knew it was going to be difficult. We knew we were going to have competition. We knew it was going to take time, but we're very convinced about it. So there was lots of conviction about that. Then, as you well said, there was no tech ecosystem, venture capital ecosystem whatsoever. But in a window of time that probably was less than a year, obviously the Dotcom boom was happening in the US, and all VCs were very active investing companies left and right. And some other financial actors, not the VCs, were paying attention to it and say, hey, there's a new reality here, there's a paradigm shift, and we need to participate. But it was hard for those outsiders of the VC world to participate. So they started to create, the banks and the corporations started to create VC vehicles to invest in technology companies, but because they couldn't do that in Silicon Valley, they started investing outside of the Silicon Valley. And some of that capital during that window of time, that again was less than a year, went to Latin America. So we could raise capital at that time, even though there was no internet around, because as you said also at the beginning, internet penetration was close to zero and e-commerce penetration was non-existent. We could raise some capital, and that allowed us to get going initially. That goes to the third pillar. We were convinced about the model. We were able to raise capital, but then we knew that availability of capital was not going to last forever, that it was going to take time because we had to wait for the internet to take off in the region. So it's not that we had, as today, 80%, 90% of the population connected to the internet. We had 1%, 2%, 3% literally connected to the web. And those connections were the dial-up connection, if you may remember, right? So it was really slow connectivity. People could get to their house and dial in to connect to the internet for an hour or two, or maybe if they were lucky, they had a broadband connection, but it was very limited. So we had to be very, very patient. We raised that first round when we started the company at the peak of the bubble, and it was really easy. A couple of guys from Stanford wanting to do something in Latin America. It was convincing enough that we got some offers and raised capital. Then, unfortunately, we very quickly burned that capital because during a period of time we thought that capital was unlimited and had to go back to the market. When we decided to go back to the market, the Nasdaq went down and down and down and down, and that round was really difficult to close. At the beginning, we had like 10 term sheets, and every day one of the investors would call, well, I'm withdrawing my term sheet, and the following day another investor was withdrawing, and suddenly we were left with one single term sheet. Our investors at the time helped us put some pressure on that investor, and we ended up closing that round. It was a miracle. That's luck. If you played 10 times that game, you lose it 9. But we were lucky enough to win it. And because we won that, we got some extra capital, actually significant capital, because the company was still very small and that was a $50 million round. So it was significant capital for the time and for the size of the company. But we realized that that was going to be the last capital we would get. And therefore, we adapted everything to ensure that we could survive the following years, to deploy our plan, to grow, but also to wait for the market to take off and do all the things that we wanted to do, but with a more careful spending. Had we started the company earlier, maybe we would have run out of capital sooner, and then to raise more capital was going to be impossible and the company would not exist today. Or had we launched the company later and we could have never closed it. So certainly luck played our favor there, but then we were very careful in how we managed the progress and the business plan of the company going forward. So that is May 2000 when we raised that round. We ended up IPOing in August 2007, and we IPO'd with $15 million of that round still in the bank. So we were very careful with our spending, ensuring that we were investing in the future, but at a pace that was somehow reasonable with what was happening with the internet, with what was happening with broadband, that clearly changed the user behavior. One other thing that did happen during that NASDAQ crash, one of those unfortunate things that end up building an incredible competitive advantage, and it was our focus on autonomy, right? And as you said, we wanted to make sure that we didn't depend on external capital anymore. And part of that made us really, really focus on building organic engines of growth and building up our technology team, building up our technology platform. So we could, by having a better platform, have more traction, more transactions, more volume transacted on our platform, and not doing that by investing in marketing. Because at the time we had many, many competitors, and all the competitors, including Mercado Libre at the beginning, had a not so great platform fueled by lots of marketing that was bringing in users, and some of the users would stay, but most of them would go away. And it was really steroids strategy, right? We were putting steroids to something that was not naturally meant to have that kind of strength. And we started building the real strength, working on our DNA, so our muscles were stronger, more resilient, would depend just on ourselves to have the force that we need and not from external factors. We ended up basically cutting down marketing 95% and just growing organically through our affiliate program, through, at the time, SEO, SEM, and things that were much more sustainable and obviously a much, much better product. So also that crisis somehow forced us and made us focus on autonomous engines of growth, and that ended up fueling the company for the following 20 years.
This is all happening in a very short amount of time. This 9-month window fundamentally shaped how you built the company, your relationship to capital, how capital is a precious resource that shouldn't be squandered and can be decisive. It's amazing to think about how a few key decisions you made then shaped the course of history for Latin American tech. You faced other challenges, the classic cold start problem, especially in that nascent environment, having to manufacture liquidity to kickstart the market, the dot-com crash, navigating partnerships with companies like eBay, basically your largest competitor. Over the years, you jumped ahead to the IPO, 2007, the first tech IPO in the US for a Latin American company. You step into the CFO role during that transition, and the company starts trading shortly after the IPO at around $1 billion. I saw the photo of you and your co-founder standing up there on the NASDAQ platform. It feels like such a pioneering moment, and one that definitely defines the beginning of what I would say is the modern tech movement in Latin America. What did that moment mean to you to have reached such an accomplishment? And especially thinking back to this young man who went to Stanford with not a whole lot of thought about what was going to be next, right? This really wasn't even on your radar. And here you are a decade later standing up on that NASDAQ platform.
When you do get the confirmation of the outside world that what you're building is useful, is successful, is appreciated, it's a significant, I think, accomplishment. Obviously, as I said, once I get into a project, I get head down on it and just think about how to make it work, how to move it from 1 to 2, from 2 to 3, always with the idea of moving it from 1 to 1,000. But you lose a little bit of context of what people think about the work you're doing. And the moment you go to the market and start speaking with investors and suddenly you become public and the general market decides what's your value and the investors vote with their paycheck and say, I want to buy more shares or sell more shares. I think it was a wow. We realized that what we're building was valuable, was appreciated. We didn't go crazy about it. Not that the IPO was the final goal of anything, but certainly I think it was an incredible accomplishment to see that others were valuing what we had. So thinking about the two moments in time when we felt, wow, there's something here is one, when we ended up having a profitable company, ended up being in 2006, because in 2005, when we saw that profitability was around the corner, we decided to overinvest again a little bit to get to profitability a little bit later on, but with a higher revenue level. But then in 2006, we did become profitable at the end of the year. And it was really incredible. As I told you, we were quite stingy over time to try to ensure that our cash in the bank would allow us to build the business we wanted to build. But every day we would go at night to bed with $11 in the bank and would wake up the following morning with 10. And then 10, 9. So we had that nervousness that, hey, we will make it. And once you go to bed and there's 7 and the following day you wake up and there's 8 and the following day there's 9, it's like, wow, it's real value, right? I always tell entrepreneurs, at the end of the day, the only reason for businesses to exist is to be profitable. We're venture capitalists. So we believe in investing today for a greater future. But eventually you need to be profitable, right? And when we did that, I think was one of the big moments, inflection point moment in wow, we did it. And I think the IPO was another one.
Well, those are definitely good lessons. And the market has certainly agrees with you. As I mentioned, in Mercado Libre is valued at over $100 billion today, which is a testament to the principles that you set out to achieve early on. It's an amazing story. By 2011, you decide you wanted to make a change, leave the company, work on something new. What went into that decision for you? And I guess more importantly, how hard was it for you to leave this thing that you had been working on so hard and so intimately? In the past, we've talked with founders who sort of a part of your identity at that point. You're so close to the company. It's such a part of who you are. But what went into that decision for you and how hard was it for you to leave?
I have 2 daughters. They are the 2 things that I love the most in my life. But probably Mercado Libre is one of the third ones, right? You really feel it like a baby and you're really proud of it and you're really committed to it. But also, as I said earlier, I was very curious and I wanted to explore new things. I felt that what we had done with Mercado Libre was incredible, but many other entrepreneurs could try to do the same. But the new company had to be created in Latin America. The opportunity then was larger than when we started Mercado Libre, because once you see that it's possible, others will dare. We also thought that there was not a VC firm like the ones we knew from the Silicon Valley that could help entrepreneurs, not only with capital, but also with value-added advice and connections and helping them hire the right person, structure the right technology stack, find the right usability for your product. We thought that there were many things that we had learned by doing them that nobody else was offering in the market. So I felt that it was the right time to move on. And I always said every 10 years, you have to reinvent yourself. I had spent 12 in Mercado Libre and it was good. And then Nicolas Sekasi, who's my co-founder, and Kaszek, who was also a fundamental piece of the Mercado Libre story, had left the company a couple of years earlier and we're in touch with him. And somehow he agreed on the vision of the VC opportunity in Latin America, combined with the tech opportunity in Latin America, of course. We decided to start Kaszek. Initially, it was a fund where we invested our capital. Marcos invested some of the capital, and we called a nice group of friends and family that were the most of the capital pool for that initial fund. And things, I think, worked out as we expected. Clearly, as you were saying in your intro, the tech ecosystem has grown significantly in Latin America. Today, you have players at all the different stages, from angel investors to early stage funds to late stage funds. All global investors today look at Latin America. Obviously, you have to offer an interesting story. You have to have a solid founding team and all the obvious things. But if you do have that, there's capital available. And in the past, I remember in our early days in Mercado Libre, of our pitch deck, the first probably 5-7 slides were about Latin America, where it was, what kind of people lived there, why we thought there was a tech opportunity in the region. And today you can skip that chapter. People have seen the Mercado Libre story, have seen the Nubank story, have heard about the vibrant tech ecosystem that is out there. They need to now find a compelling business model led by great founders. But if they do find that, they are willing to invest.
You mentioned the inception of the firm, the challenge you were solving, right? Have people who were founders and company builders leading venture capital firms. Obviously much more common in the US, still not as common in Latin America even today. So the problem you were solving, your personal motivation is obvious. But I'm also curious, in the beginning, just practically speaking, were there any design choices that you and Nicholas made that defined the firm from day one? Maybe ways that made it adaptable, this kind of your experience, the Silicon Valley model, but making it relevant for building in Latin America?
First, obviously, our focus was Latin America. So there had to be a Latin American angle to the business, to the story, to the founder, because we thought that globally there were great VCs. And if we had to invest in someone doing something outside of the region, we're relatively smart people and somehow understand technology, but there were many others that could do that as well or better than us. But in Latin America, we thought that we had an edge because we could connect the entrepreneur with the right companies, with the right clients, with the right teams and everything else. So certainly we were very convinced that we could help people better in Latin America. Also, our operational experience was relevant. So it was not only capital and connection, but also, hey, we did it this way, it worked, so why not try it? Or we did it this way and it didn't work. So make sure you avoid that mistake. Or if you want to do it, do something different, because if you do the same thing, probably you're going to find the same mistake. But we also did lots of initially hand-holding. Most of the entrepreneurs at the time in Latin America were equally smart, committed, ambitious than those that you would find in the Silicon Valley, but knew less about term sheets, knew less about the VC world, knew less about, hey, how do you stage a business plan to execute your vision? And we had to do lots of hand-holding at the beginning. Obviously, there were some entrepreneurs like David Vélez, that was part of our first fund, that was coming from Sequoia and had studied in Stanford, so he had all the pieces that he needed. But that was not the average entrepreneur at the time. Things have evolved, and because of this ecosystem that has moved in the right direction and is today much more developed, today you meet with entrepreneurs in Latin America and they are very knowledgeable about what needs to happen in your business and how you structure it and what kind of partners you have to find. At that time, we were very committed to being very active board members. And today we're still close, but at that beginning, we were much closer.
You mentioned also your early investors. It was your own capital. It was people close to you, friends and family. Eventually, you would start raising larger pools of capital, institutional investors. Obviously now have billions in AUM. What was it like getting those initial LPs, especially the large US-based global LPs, to buy into your vision and believe what you're doing? You were mentioning in the early days of the Mercado Libre deck, 5 or 7 slides was about Latin America. Here's where it is. Here's the people. I got to imagine there was some element of that in convincing investors to follow that same vision in Kaszek. How did you convince people that this was something worth backing?
I think it was a very natural process, and we were also quite lucky. We raised our first fund because people knew Mercado Libre and people had somehow a connection with us. there was one institutional investor that came. I think they sent an email to info@Kaszek, and somehow we answered it and ended up being a great partner, a great LP that still is an LP in every one of our funds since then. But that was the only institutional LP that we had in that first fund. But it was great because we also said from the very beginning that we wanted to build a firm for the long run, and we knew that we were going to need more permanent capital, and that comes from institutional investors. So by bringing in this investor was great for us because it was an investor, a fund of funds, very active in the tech space, and allowed us to somehow set the benchmark at a higher level of what things we wanted to accomplish, formalities we had to have with the fund, etc. And then when the second fund came, a few others joined, and when the third one, a few more. And eventually Latin America became more and more popular, and we were doing a good job, and we started to show not only a promise, but also results from our earlier funds, and investors were happy. So it was a very natural process. Next time we go to the market, we'll see what happens. In this business, you're all the time proving yourself again and again and again, because what you did is great for the next cycle or for the next few companies, but then you have to keep on renewing your portfolio and showing the same upside and keep on renewing your LP pool to ensure that you have the capital you need to invest in the opportunities you find. But that was a very natural process, and we ended up finding great institutional investors. The LP base changed. It initially, as I said, was mostly friends and family, and today it's mostly endowments, foundations, a few fund of funds, a few sovereign funds. And today also, because they look for global diversity, they understand that Latin America is relevant and they want to have some exposure there. They're not committing 50% of their funds to Latin America, but maybe they want to have 3, 5, 7% of exposure there. And I think we're a good option for them.
Let's talk a minute about your investing approach. You've been the founder, operator. You've started companies, scaled them, taking them public. You've invested in some of the best entrepreneurs, not only in the region, but globally, that happen to be from the region. You hinted at a few of the things that you think are helpful for companies to have this obsession with the challenge, understanding the problem they're solving, having a mind towards profitability. What are the things that you think are the marks for successful founders? What do you look for in an entrepreneur who's pitching you on their company?
We look for 3 things. One is the team, one is the business model, and the other one is the market. And the deepest area is the team, right? People that are capable, that are committed to what they are solving in an irrational way. They want to solve it because there's nothing else they can do with their lives if they don't solve that. And it's not they want to solve it because they did some numbering on an Excel and say, hey, this is a profitable opportunity. It needs to be something that goes beyond that. We want to see that fire in their eyes when they talk about the problem they're solving and why they believe they have the right to win. We really pay lots of attention to the team. Obviously, sometimes we invest in experienced executives or even second or third time entrepreneurs where you can see what they've done in the past and somehow project those past experiences into the future. Sometimes we invest in very young entrepreneurs, so it's harder to find data on their past, and we're big believers in that idea that past behavior is a good predictor of future behavior. And in that case, you try to find references, you try to meet with the entrepreneurs many times and understand how they think, how they commit, how they act when they encounter problems, and how they relate with others, with their teams, with their co-founders, and try to read that well. And they need to have a broad definition of leadership. They need to be able to attract talent to the company. They need to be able to attract others into the story. So sell that to the market, to the investors, attract, obviously, customers, our clients, by building a great technology platform. So the team is something very, very relevant, but I would say the most important thing is that irrational commitment that will make them stay involved and work hard when it looks like you're failing. Because all companies at some point think that they're going to fail. We experienced that ourselves with Mercado Libre several times. And you only go through those death valleys if you really believe that failure is not an option. You have to make it work. And then in terms of the business model, it needs to be a business model that eventually will see light at the end of the tunnel. And the tunnel is reasonably long, not too long that you think it's going to be hard to continue financing this venture, because one of the things that you have to acknowledge is that probably in Latin America, you do have financing, but it's not the kind of financing that you can get in deeper markets. And obviously, you need to be in a business model where you build competitive advantages. So again, nothing is absolute in technology. Your competitive advantages today fade away if you don't keep on investing in them tomorrow. But at least ensure that when you're building something and you gain some initial success, that success grants you a cushion of protection versus the newcomer that maybe is trying to eat your lunch the following day. In terms of the market, very obvious, but it needs to be a large market. We all heard this many times, but solving a big problem or a small problem takes probably the same amount of effort. But if you end up solving a big problem, you get a much bigger price.
Yeah, one of the things that people ask me as a US-based investor, why am I so excited about investing in startups in LatAm? It's always the same, which is the talent is what drew me in the most. It's so recognizable. The problems are enormous, right? And they're very large markets. But as you know, it's a different game. Building companies, backing entrepreneurs in emerging ecosystems is very different from how you might build a company in Silicon Valley or New York or other places in the US. So with that lens, this is a platform about outsiders, entrepreneurs from atypical backgrounds, or more specifically, overlooked geographies who have built great companies in spite of the odds. I would say you're backing a lot of outsiders. What is it that you look for? Maybe the things that you think entrepreneurs who are building from these markets, things that they need to understand that maybe entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley or other mature markets don't necessarily have to account for?
Certainly, when you're building something new, there are challenges. And it doesn't matter if you're doing that in a very developed market and very developed country, or if you're doing that in an emerging economy with something that is new. But I do agree with that challenges change in Latin America. The ecosystem has grown, and we've described it as more complete today, but there are still many, many gaps. And in particular, when you go to solving a problem, you identify one problem and you want to fill that gap, but then you realize that on the way to filling in that gap, there are many other gaps that appear because the infrastructure is not there. So you need to be much more comprehensive in your solution. Like when you are building something in the US, let's say, you can really focus on just one particular vertical where you feel that there's a gap and be very obsessed about it. When you're building in Latin America, you need to start building things around that opportunity, because you need the first version of Mercado Libre didn't have a payments mechanism. And then, hey, people are trading things, but it'd be much easier if we could also solve the payment challenge. And if you were in the US, eBay had PayPal, and there were other mechanisms to pay for the items you were buying. Now to Latin Americans, and you need to start building lots of things around that solution that you're building for it to work. So that's a challenge. You need to have a much more open mind, be willing to address problems that you think maybe are not yours. But if you don't solve them, nobody solves them, then you cannot really provide the solution where you're trying to build. But at the same time, if you end up doing that, maybe your model ends up being more resilient, more defensible, because you own not only that particular solution, but also the ecosystem that serves that solution. And once you build something that has synergies, the value you end up creating is larger. Therefore, the value you can capture is larger. And that becomes more defensible because you own not only your solution, but also part of the solution that others might need to build an alternative to your solution.
Well, speaking of ecosystems, I'd like to talk for a minute about the ecosystem in Latin America. Obviously, very different today than the ecosystem that you launched Mercado Libre into. We've talked about some of those breakout companies, but I think it goes much deeper than that. In many ways, I think the secret about the potential for tech in Latin America is out of the bag, but there's still a long way to go. I'm curious what you think is the state of the tech ecosystem in Latin America today. How should people who are less familiar with the region be thinking about its potential? And then where you think things are going? Where is Latin America going to be in 10, 20 years from now?
Latin America is still an emerging market where some gaps that are quite covered in more developed part of the world remain quite open here. And that, I think, offers a very, very, very compelling case for technology. Because in other markets, you have traditional solutions that have solved those problems, and now you have a much better solution with technology. And in Latin America, you don't have that in many cases, or the gap is much wider. So what you bring from Latin America is not a significant improvement, but basically a solution that before didn't exist. When you look at a market for technology, you can say, hey, in the US, you have a larger market. That is true. But when you look at Latin America, you say, hey, there's a bigger gap. And that is true as well. If you want to sell cars, probably you will end up selling more cars in the US than in Brazil. But if nobody is selling cars in Brazil and many companies are selling cars in the US, maybe the opportunity in Brazil is worth the effort. And I think many of those things are playing out in Latin America. So I think the net impact of technology in the world is going to be terrific, but it's going to be larger in emerging markets because you have a decent healthcare system in the US and you don't have that in Latin America, or the same thing with financial inclusion, or the same thing with education, or the same thing with access to goods at attractive prices. Because in Latin America, you don't have a network of traditional retailers that offer you decent prices across the countries. So I think in Latin America, the opportunity is really large. And technology will help us fill those gaps that we have in the market. So the opportunity is terrific. I look at the opportunity we had with Mercado Libre, and we thought it was incredible. And then I look at what that opportunity was 10 years after that, and it was larger. And then I look at the opportunity we have today, it's even larger, right? I'm very bullish. I do believe that technology will help us solve many of the challenges we have as humans. And certainly there are more challenges in Latin America than in the US, and technology will help us close those gaps. So I think opportunity is terrific. And the fact that now we have companies that have proven that those business models can work well in Latin America, the Mercado Libres, the Nubanks, and the QuintoAndares, and the Nubank shops, and many others that will come, I think in a way will only make this more attractive. And more at a macro level, I also think that we are entering in a positive cycle for Latin America. It's not going to be an amazing tailwind, but I think it's going to be a positive one. We started talking about this probably 7 years ago when people started talking about having supply chains more connected to the markets that had the main demand for those products. And then COVID came and that became more critical. And then you started having some tensions between China and the US. And I think that Latin America is really well positioned to offer lots of the products and services that developed markets need. Certainly a very strong base for commodities, for energy. Politically, I think the region is becoming more reasonable. I'm quite bullish with Latin America in terms of the macro view it may have going forward. But then on top of that, technology is going to have an incredible impact. And both companies, Nubank and Mercado Libre, were built in Latin America with less of a favorable context. You cannot imagine the many challenges that Nubank went through in Brazil, that Mercado Libre went through in Brazil, Argentina, Venezuela. With all those challenges, they ended up building amazing companies that are global benchmarks in their industries. So I think that now the bull case is more compelling.
I agree with that. I'm excited to see how it shapes out. I'll certainly be spending the rest of my career working in the region.
Looking forward to it.
So maybe a last big question for you. When you zoom out and look at this arc of your career, you've co-founded one of the region's most important companies, helping to kickstart a tech movement in the region. You've backed and helped shape an entire generation of founders. The impact you've had is widespread and clear. 10, 20 years from now, when you look back on things, what do you hope becomes true for the tech ecosystem in Latin America? And what do you hope is the impact that you've had?
I really hope that first and foremost, the region can solve most of those gaps that we still have. Obviously, it will not be easy and it will require lots of work, but I think it will happen. Obviously, there are things like energy and other basic industries that need to work well, but I think some of the solutions will come from technology, and I hope that we play a good role in helping entrepreneurs build those solutions. And I'm very proud of what we've built so far with Mercado Libre and Kaszek, but I'm really focused on how can we help the next entrepreneur build the next solution. I'm focused on those companies that are emerging today, the Canastras, the Dollar Apps, the Cobre, the Nubank shops of the world, and hopefully they will end up building great companies with lots of technology, creating lots of high-quality jobs for Latin Americans, impacting millions of lives positively with a meritocratic system, things that have been quite common in the Silicon Valley for several decades now. They're going to become more common in Latin America because of these entrepreneurs.
One of the things that I've observed is that young, smart people talk less about how do I get the job in consulting or banking, and they're thinking more about working in tech companies, starting tech companies.
That's part of the change in the ecosystem that you mentioned, a very significant one. When we started Mercado Libre, all graduates were aspiring to get a job, and it was totally fine, but that was what they looked up to. And today they look up to joining a startup or starting a startup. And I think that shift in mentality is a very positive one.
It's exciting. Well, I look forward to checking back in with you on this and see how things evolve. We're almost out of time, but before I let you go, we like to finish with a segment we call Beyond the Bio. Just some quick hit questions to kind of go beyond your resume and get to know you as a person. Sound okay?
Sure.
So what's a quick piece of advice from a mentor that's stuck with you throughout your journey?
Focus on the long run. I think that has been a very important one.
Long-term thinking, essential. Who is an unsung hero in your life, and what has been the impact they've had on you?
I mentioned my parents, both of them. I think that I got great things from my father, who was a sports and fanatic and an amazing cheerleader of his children. And whatever we would do, that could be starting Mercado Libre or having, I don't know, a pickup game at the corner of our house. He was our number one cheerleader. And I think that allowed us to dare, to believe in ourselves, to feel supported. And my mom, that really focused on education, and for me was a factor that really changed my life.
Well, I can see you're carrying that legacy on today. Who is someone in the Latin American startup community, or maybe in your broader network, who doesn't get enough credit and deserves a shout out?
I would say that Marcos Galperin, always being the founder of the largest company in Latin America, the most valuable company in Latin America, someone that people know, but there's still some controversy. Like whenever he writes a tweet, half of the people say, well, this is the most amazing guy, and half are, I don't know if it's jealousy or what is it, but he gets criticized. I saw his work firsthand, so I was next to him, and it's really amazing what he's done. And going back to the gaps that Latin America has and the region we aspire to have, we'd be in an incredible position if we had 10 Marcos Galperins instead of one. And he doesn't get that level of credit, I think.
That's a great insight. Tell us something most people don't know about you, something outside of work, maybe a hobby, a favorite travel spot, a guilty pleasure, or a hidden talent.
One thing that people may not know is that I'm quite shy, but I learned to fight against that. I'm curious and like to test myself. I force myself into a podcast with you, even though I'm not the most comfortable person doing this, but I decide to face my fears rather than hide them. But even though you might not realize, I'm nervous now talking with you.
Oh. Well, it's amazing. I appreciate you breaking through that and sharing that vulnerability. I felt the same way. I used to hate public speaking so much. And then I just forced myself to say yes to every opportunity. And eventually now it's just another thing. And so I can definitely relate to you on that. What are one or two songs you'd like to add to our Spotify Founders playlist? Something that you might listen to throughout the workday or maybe has inspired you on your journey as an entrepreneur?
I'm a big fan of the Rolling Stones. There was one song that I used to play before going to an exam. There was Mixed Emotions. I like a lot. In the days of Mercado Libre, we used to, every time we were dealing with a hard problem and couldn't find a solution, someone would play the Rocky song, Eye of the Tiger, and that would pamper us. So those two have some history with me.
Yeah, those are two great additions. Thank you for those. What about books? Are there any books that have been especially influential or books that you might recommend?
Yeah, I read many. Top of my list are probably a couple of biographies. One is Snowball on Warren Buffett. You cannot say that Warren Buffett does not get the credit he deserves, but I think he deserves even more credit than what he gets, because to be an investor that could see through things, that could change his winning strategy a few times over his career and succeed over probably 70, 75 years is incredible. And Snowball is one book that I really like. The other one is the famous biography of Steve Jobs by Walter Isaacson, which I think is great. And very few books I read twice. There are a couple from Garcia Marquez that I love, and Steve Jobs' biography is one of those as well that I read twice.
Okay, those are some great books. So last question. If you could give one piece of advice to someone who's about to start their first company, particularly someone who's maybe a bit of an outsider, what would it be?
Act out of conviction or do not act.
I can't think of a better way to end. Hernan, thank you so much for sharing your time with me today. I can't wait to share this episode with our listeners.
No, thank you so much for inviting me. Thank you so much for all the work you did, because every single thing that you said about my past was correct. That is not typically the case. So amazing and great question. So thank you so much for everything and for the opportunity.
That's a wrap for today's episode of Outsider Inc. A big thank you to Hernan Kazah for joining us today to share his incredible journey and wisdom. Hernan's story is a reminder that outsider isn't a disadvantage. It's a forcing function. When the ecosystem isn't there, you can't lean on momentum. You have to manufacture it. You don't just build a company, you build the conditions around it. Trust, infrastructure, resilience, and eventually, belief. What I took most from this conversation is how quietly disciplined that really is. Confidence without ego, patience without passivity, ambition with a long-term lens. Because in the end, the people who change a market aren't the ones with the cleanest plan. They're the ones who stay standing long enough for the plan to become real. And if there's one lesson Hernan leaves us with, it's this: act out of conviction or don't act at all. If you want more from Outsider Inc., don't forget to subscribe to the platform at outsiderinc.substack.com. It's packed with highlights from today's episode and bonus insights you won't want to miss. You can follow Outsider Inc. on YouTube, Instagram, TikTok, and LinkedIn at Outsider Inc. Pod. You can also follow me on X at Ian Hathaway. Outsider Inc. is produced by Spellbinder Media. We'll be back soon with another fascinating outsider conversation. Until then, thank you so much for listening. And remember, great entrepreneurs can come from anywhere. See you next time.